Sveiki, šiandien laidoje turime išskirtinį svečią, buvusį JAV gynybos sekretorių Marką Esperį. Apie karą Ukrainoje ir Baltijos šalių saugumus su juo kalbamės Vilniaus rotušėje. Dr. Esperis, thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be with you.
You served as Secretary of Defense in Donald Trump's administration, and you have a good understanding of his way of thinking. If Mr. Trump or another Republican with similar approach to international relations is elected, what would this mean for Ukraine and for the Baltic states?
Well, I don't believe that another Republican candidate will emerge in the primary contest that will share the views of Donald Trump. So I think there is Trump and then there is everybody else. And that contest has just begun in the United States with regard to the Republican primary. It will take a year to find out who that candidate will be. I'm hopeful that we will have a new leader, a new generation, frankly, in both parties, to lead the United States forward. And I'm confident that whoever that new leader is, that he or she will continue to support Ukraine and will continue to be very pro-NATO and will recognize that we are in this global struggle between autocracy and democracy. So I'm optimistic with regard to that new generation of leaders coming forward.
Let me ask you, but if Mr. Trump is elected again, should that be a matter for concern for us?
Yes, it should be. Donald Trump is very clear about what he said and what he believes with regard to the alliance and members, as we all know, not paying their fair share, if you will, with regard to their commitments made. And I think that if he were to become president again, which I hope that does not happen, I think he would pursue some of those ambitions, and not just with regard to Europe, but in Asia as well. We have, thousands of American forces deployed in Korea and Japan, for example.
Dr. Esper, you had also presentations by Lithuanian, both political and military leaders, about how Lithuania and the region is transforming amid the war in Ukraine. What lessons do you think our country should learn from the war when planning its defense together with allies?
Well, first of all, I want to give Lithuania a lot of credit. I think Lithuania and the other Baltic states as well have been real leaders with regard to supporting Ukraine. The United States obviously is giving the largest amount of money, $31.5 billion so far. Germany has done a lot, Poland has done a lot. But it's been the Baltic states and Lithuania in particular that has really punched above its weight in terms of what it's giving as a percentage of its GDP. So I want to give it a lot of credit on that front. Clearly, the Vilnius summit comes up this July. There will be a lot of important moments there. I think it will be an historic one. I think we should look to raise our commitment with regard to spending on GDP. But why is that important? It's important because of the question you asked. What did we learn from Russia's unlawful, brutal invasion of Ukraine? We've learned, first of all, that a determined, committed people who want to defend their sovereignty and who are willing to show the courage and bravery to do so can beat back a much bigger foe. And that's what the Ukrainians have done, a nation of 44 million beating back a country of 140, 150 million people, the fourth largest army in the world or so. And so I think they've showed us a great deal in terms of will, the willingness to fight. But in terms of battlefield, they've showed us that, look, you need to have certain capabilities. Many of them asymmetric, air defense, man-portable anti-tank systems. You need to have mobility on the battlefield. I think you need to have territorial defenses. In other words, a people who are willing to take up arms and know how to use them. And I think that's one of the more dramatic stories of this conflict has been President Zelensky's willingness to stay in Kyiv and fight the fight, and then the thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian men and women who signed up to join their country's military to fight. Some returned from abroad to fight, and that says a lot about the courage and the resiliency of the Ukrainian people.
In 2019, it was your initiative that brought the U.S. battalion to Lithuania, and those rotations do continue up to this date. However, Lithuanians keep asking, and they asked in the conference about for the rotational force to be replaced by a permanent force. Do you think it's needed, and do you think it's likely?
Well, I've always been pro-NATO. I served in NATO, I served in Europe, so the decision in 2019 was not a hard one. particularly given the vulnerability, if you will, of the Baltic states, the proximity of Belarus and Russia. So I thought it was very important to do so, to provide that capability here. Since then, of course, we've also developed relationships with other allies. I was fortunate yesterday to visit the Iron Wolf Brigade. I spoke with the Chief of Staff out there. There was a German commander present who commands the EFP battalion. And so I think that relationship is working well. With regard to the Americans, there is a battalion now, as we know. I know there's this debate whether there should be a permanent or persistent presence. And I spoke about this last night at the Baltic Military Conference. I think what would be needed to have a permanent presence for U.S. forces would be to have to build up all that infrastructure, training ranges, maneuver areas, housing, barracks, daycare centers, schools, hospitals. I think that's an enormous amount of investment and would take years to do in order to enable a permanent presence. And so I question whether that's worth it for both the United States and Lithuania to make those type of investments over time, as compared to putting that same money toward military capability. And then we sustain it on a persistent basis where you have U.S. forces deployed forward, persistent. I think that gives you the same effect. And if there are sufficient training areas, ranges, maneuver capabilities, I think you can maintain a much more ready force, a much more focused force, and be able to do what we want to do, and that is reassure Lithuania, deter the Russians, and have as much combat capability forward as possible. Right now, I think we have too much combat capability back in Germany and other places, so I think we should continue to push forward eastward.
Let me ask you straightforward. How would you assess the likelihood of a Russian attack against the Baltic states?
I actually think it's unlikely, but we know Russia can be unpredictable. And so for that reason, we have to continue to maintain a strong and resilient combat power forward. And I say that because, look, Russia can't beat Ukraine. And Ukrainians are beating them back pretty bad at a strategic level, operational level, and tactical level. In Bakhmut alone right now, we know that for every Ukrainian killed, they believe they are killing 5, 6, 7 Russians. So I think it would be really foolhardy for Putin to take on NATO, to invade a NATO country. So in that regard, I think it's highly unlikely. But that doesn't mean we should rule it out, and we shouldn't prepare for it.
What are your expectations for the Ukrainian spring counteroffensive?
Well, my expectations are high for a number of reasons. I think after a very successful offensive in the early fall of last year, it's been a while since we've seen something on the ground. So much of continued Western support will rely on the Ukrainians to demonstrate to Western countries, some NATO capitals, that they can continue to fight, that they can push the Russians back, and that they can indeed win. So what I hope to see in April or May would be a major Ukrainian counteroffensive led with heavy forces, armored and mechanized, that penetrates the current, what I would call static line that now sits from the east to the south, penetrate that line. I want to see them push Russian forces back to the east and down to the south, and maybe reach as far as the coastline and cut the lines of communication. I think if they can do that, that would be a very important achievement, particularly going into Vilnius summit, the NATO summit in July. And I think that will give us a lot of enthusiasm. Hopefully that will push, encourage Washington and other capitals to accelerate the delivery of arms, ammunition, and assistance to Ukraine, and then they can continue that offensive through the fall.
Let me turn to China, and Chinese President Xi Jinping recently visited Moscow. What is the significance, not only of this visit, but of the partnership that we are seeing between Moscow and Beijing?
Well, it shows that the partnership between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin is alive and well. There was some discussion after the invasion last February that Xi Jinping would distance himself from Putin, and that you might see some diversion between the two, but now we have seen that that's not the case. And we do know that China is assisting Russia in Ukraine. They are buying energy, they are providing technical support, they are providing dual-use items that are being used on the battlefield, and there are some indications now that there may be Chinese munitions in Ukraine. So I think we need to be very conscious of that fact, that partnership is not going away, for two reasons. Putin cannot afford to lose that relationship with the Chinese, and the Chinese can't afford to lose that partnership with Russia. From the Chinese perspective, they want a friendly country on their 2,500-mile border with Russia. They want a friendly autocracy. They don't want a Western democracy. And China also needs certain technologies from the Russians that they can't master on their own: air defenses, submarine technology, etc. So for those reasons, I think this partnership will continue.
What would that mean for the global security? I just want to repeat the question that I asked during this morning the Prime Minister. If we look at the worst case scenario, let's say we take 2030 and Russia would have reconstituted its forces, and China makes a decision to move to Taiwan, and then we may have two fronts. Is the West capable to hold these two fronts, taking into account the will of both sides and also the capabilities on both sides?
I would be surprised if Russia could carry this fight on for 7 more years. They certainly have the manpower if young men don't flee Russia like they did at the first conscription. But their ability to regenerate their arms and munitions, I think, for 7 years would be quite a stretch. It's difficult for the West to do it. And so I think at worst case, I don't discount it, but at worst case, it ends up in some type of frozen conflict, if you will, like we see in Georgia or Moldova. So I don't see that happening. I would argue that we should never let up on sanctions against Russia as long as Vladimir Putin is in power and as long as Russia occupies Ukraine. And if we can manage to do that, maintain the political will, we can continue to strangle the Russian economy. I think that will be an important thing. Now, look, China's a completely different case now. If we determine that China is providing lethal aid to Russia, then I think it'll be a very important decision for the West. I'm confident the United States will sanction China. I don't know whether that'll be financially, economically, diplomatically, or one of the above. But the question is, will Europe, will Berlin, will Paris, will other countries be willing to do that? That's going to be a major test for us, and whether we will stand up to the Chinese as well. And I think in the near term, that's what I'm looking at with some concern as we think about what may lie ahead in the coming months.
Dr. Esperis, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.